Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week I am recording a little differently instead of live with the group. So I wanted to make sure I get this teaching out. Our plans changed a little bit, and so we had to just shift and adjust some things. So this week I'm going to go through the regular parsha. And I will come back to the Revelation teaching in a couple of weeks, so as things are going along. So this week, our parsha is Nitzavim, which is in Deuteronomy 29:9 and goes through chapter 30, verse 20. And so this parsha comes at the end of the month of Elul. We're getting ready next week to have Yom Teruah or Rosh Hashanah. So that is actually coming up. So this portion is the closing out of the month of Elul and leading us into the seventh month, which is Tishri and the fall feast. So this parsha is like always read the Shabbat before Yom Teruah. And it's no accident that, that within it we see that the children of Israel are gathered together in order to, enter into the covenant before entering into the promised land. It's sort of a redoing, a re-ratification of the covenant here. And it's also important that this parsha happens right before Tishri, the seventh month, because Tishri is connected with the tribe of Ephraim. And we know that Ephraim was actually scattered amongst the nations in the world. And so with this, we know that because Ephraim was scattered, they ceased to be known as a people. Okay. And so this first, this parsha Nitzavim takes its name from the Hebrew word, which is, for standing. You are standing. And I'm going to start in Deuteronomy chapter 29 in verse 9. Just a second, let me change that. Today you are standing, all of you, before Yah your Elohim, your heads, your tribes, your leaders, and your officers, all of the men of Israel, along with your little ones, your wives, and your foreigners here with you in your camp, from the one who chops the wood to the one who draws the water. The purpose is that you should enter into the covenant of Yah your Elohim and into his oath, which Yah your Elohim is making with you today, so that he can establish you today for himself as a people, and so that for you he will be God. And he said to you, as he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So as we look at the very first verse there, and you're looking at it in the Hebrew, what's interesting is that there's another connection that can be made with this verse and Ephraim, because this first verse that starts Deuteronomy 29:9, that today you're standing, all of you, before Yah your Elohim, your heads, your tribes, your leaders, and your officers, and all of the men of Israel. When you look at that in Hebrew, there are actually 65 letters. And that connects with Ephraim. Okay. And where do I get that from? If we go to Isaiah chapter 7, and I'm going to read verse 8 and 9. So Isaiah 7, 8, and 9. For the head of Amram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. In 65 years, Ephraim will be broken and will cease to be a people. And the head of Ephraim is Shomron, and the head of Shomron is the son of Remulah. Without firm faith, you will not be firmly established. So here we see this link with the 65 years that Ephraim would be broken. And if they would not stand in faith, if they would not stand, is the way that actually the verse is translated. When Ephraim ceases to be a people of Yah, when they're removing themselves from the very covenant that they entered into here in this portion. So, as if they've had a support structure taken away. They're depleted. Their strength is gone. So it's, that looks like what's happening here. And Ephraim's name means double fruitful, or like a double ash heap, because afar is the word for ash too. So when we look at Ephraim's name, it can actually be made up of two words. It can be made up of afar, which is dust or ashes, and the word yam, Ephraim, the yam at the end, the yud and the mem, and that's the word for sea. So these two things together, we see that we have dust and we have water together. And where do we also see that? Is in Numbers chapter 5, when it's talking about the bitter waters of jealousy that's used to judge whether that wife is adulterous or not. And that's exactly what Ephraim did. And so there's also the waters of purification, that those waters that are mixed with the ashes, the dust of the red heifer, in order to cleanse a person from death. And so we are a part of Ephraim, the adulterous bride. We've been scattered. We are to stand and hear the words of the covenant. And how we respond, there will be two results. Either we're going to be cleansed and purified, and we're going to have that purification from our unclean state and bear fruit, or we will be judged by those bitter waters, just like the woman who drank those bitter waters. Either her belly is going to swell up and she looks like she's pregnant, and it says her thigh will rot, or everything's going to be fine and she is going to go on and bear and have children. So we're either going to be that purified woman and bear fruit, or we're going to be judged by those bitter waters if we choose to neglect our duties to Torah. Now, Deuteronomy 29:9 also starts with Atim Nitzavim, which is all of you are standing. Okay. And so, but what's really interesting is the word that's chosen for standing, because normally the word for stand is the word amad. And it's not used here. That's the typical word for it. But instead, the Torah uses Nitzav, the root Nitzav here. And Nitzav means more than just stand. It is actually to be established, to take a stand, to station oneself, to be like a prefect or someone that's appointed, that's standing firm. They're standing erect or fixed or established. That is what Nitzav denotes, is denoting that firmness, that taking a stand and stability. And with everything that's been going on recently in our world, and like with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it reminded me that it's a time for people to take a stand on Yah's word. It's like saying, the old saying that you better stand for something or you're going to fall for anything. And that's what we need to do. We need to be standing firm on his word. And that Nitzavim speaks of that fortitude and that courage that comes from the knowledge of having his word in us. And if it's in us, then it's going to be exhibited through our actions. So here we are standing here, at the end, right here, close to the end of the reading of the Torah cycle. And we ought to be much wiser than we were at the very beginning. And just as the children of Israel are now, here standing at the edge of the promised land, and they're shortly going to be entering into the land, and they're going to have to start over again from the beginning, Bereshit from the beginning. And just before we enter the land, it's like a turning over a new year in the Torah. Moshe tells us to stand and reflect on those lessons that we've learned so far, in order that we can start over again and be on a better footing and to be better than we were the day before. And sometimes, we might get bogged down in, all things that are happening. But if we just take one day and say, okay, today, let me do something better than I did yesterday, and take that approach, then we are progressively getting better. Now, what's interesting is that this root, Nitzavim, the very first occurrence we see of this word happens, of course, back in Genesis. So I want to go to that first occurrence because that usually sets the precedent for the meaning of the word. So let's go to Genesis chapter 18, and I want to go to verse 2. So Genesis 18 and verse 2. It says, he raised his eyes and looked, and there in front of him stood three men. And on seeing them, he ran to the tent door to meet them and prostrated himself on the ground. Okay, so when we see that there were three men who stood, that is that root Nitzavim. Okay, and you think about these three men were actually messengers here. These three messengers were standing. They were there to do something specific. They had to act. And just like, these three messengers, we are to stand. We are to do something. We are to act out his word. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, it tells us that these things happened to them as prefigurative historical events, and they were written down as a warning to us who are living in the Aher Hayamim, the last days. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he is standing up be careful not to fall. So all of those examples in the Tanakh are given for our admonition. They're given so that we will learn lessons from them, so that we can Nitzavim, so that we can stand firm on the Torah. And Shaul Paul is warning us against the danger of thinking that we're standing and we're steadfast, and yet we're not learning from those examples that have been written for us. If we're not, if you think that's done away with and you're not learning from it, then you're not really standing firm. He's telling us those are examples for us to learn by. And so he's warning us against that delusion of thinking that we're standing when the Torah is not being properly guarded and studied. And, many today assume that they're in a steadfast position, but yet their ability to recognize the trickery and deception and delusion of, twisted teachings is severely lacking because they take no interest in the Torah or the Tanakh or the word of Yah. They disregard it from its original Hebrew, which, could open up the word for them. And instead, they're being led astray down a path. And I've used this analogy before about a lot of times if we see a puzzle and it's missing a piece and it's a very important piece, it could lead us to make a wrong inference or a wrong conclusion. And once we have that missing piece, that understanding, it changes our whole perspective on that. And that's something I think that is sorely lacking today. And that, we really need to look at the historical context of when things were written, who they were written to, and what was the meaning of that time. Now, notice in verse 29, 9 and 10, who was gathered together, who was assembled here. We have the officers, the leaders, the tribes, and the heads of all of the men. And, it even specifically says your wives, your foreigners, and the one who chops wood to the one who draws water. And, this reminded me of the verse in Numbers 15 and 15 that says that there's one law, the same law for you as for the foreigner living with you. And this is a permanent regulation through all of your generations. So the foreigner is to be treated the same way before Yah as yourselves. So there was to be one law, not there was one law for the Jew and one law for the non-Jew. There was to be one law for all. And here in this parsha, we also see it includes, children and wives, as well as the men and the foreigners. Those who have attached themselves to Israel as a people. And, something I think that, stuck out with me too, as I was looking at this, is that in those first two verses, Deuteronomy 29, that it starts with, today you are standing. Well, something we miss in English is you can be singular or it can be plural. And when we look at, talking about you are standing here and we read this, and then we also read it in the Hebrew and we look at the word Nitzavim, and then we get to Deuteronomy 29 and verse 11, it says, so the purpose is that you should enter into the covenant of Yah, your Elohim, and into his oath, which Yah, your Elohim, is making with you today. And it is the word la'avrecha. And so that, that you should enter in. Okay. And so when we look at those two words, we're missing what it's saying, because is it really talking about at the beginning, you are standing, all of you, and then we've got this that is plural there. But when you get to verse 11, it says, so the purpose is so that you can enter. It is individual. It is singular now. It is that word la'avreha. And so it is that singular, not the plural. And that really stuck out to me, because even though they're all individually gathered there together, they're there as a group, yet the purpose is so that you, even though you're united, but it comes back to your individual heart. You are entering into the covenant. So you have to be in unity with the rest of the body, but it's also about your heart individually making that. So, it's about that collectivism. It's how we're collectively gathered. It's going to affect things. And then when you're a part of that covenant, whatever, when you're a part of that covenant, whatever you do affects the rest of the body. Sometimes people think, well, their sin is just their sin and it doesn't impact anybody else but them. But actually, their sin is impacting those around them too. So it's not just them that's being impacted. It is people that are around them. So this parsha too is written on the last day of Moshe's life. And it is when this covenant renewal is taking place with the children of Israel. And again, like I said, that word la'avreha is, it's an individual thing. And it is actually from that root avar, which means to cross over, which is where we get the word Hebrew from. But not only that, but it's talking about us crossing over into the covenant. And then, so when we're coming into this covenant, or we're reaffirming this covenant, it says that word oath. It actually uses the word oath here. Oath is the word Allah, which actually, is to swear, but it's also the word for curse. If you're putting someone under a curse or an oath, it's, what's going to happen. So when we're crossing over into his covenant, we recognize and we're accepting that there are conditions that he's outlined in this covenant that are promises, but there are also curses. So it's included in that. And all of Israel is assembled before him. This covenant was for all of Israel. It's not only for a certain group of people. It's not only for the priest. It's not only for the men. It was for all of Israel. If we go down to verse 13, and depending on which version you're in, it might be verse 14 and 15. Deuteronomy 29, it says, but I am making this covenant and this oath not only with you, rather, I'm making it both with him who is standing here today with us before Yah, our Elohim, and also with him who is not here with us today. So not only was each individual member of the community involved in reestablishing the covenant, but this covenant also included those that were not there at that time, those that were in the future. So, this covenant, this Brit was made for the Israelites, past, present, and future. Well, how is the world, you think about how is that really possible? And it's because Yah is eternal. It makes perfect sense when you think about he would enter into a covenant, a Brit, for all generations. And that's basically what the Torah is stating here. It is that it's made also with him who's not here today, those generations in the future, those of us today. That we're definitely in their future, but it was for us today that we're entering into that covenant. And the Torah is our ketubah, it's our wedding contract. And, a lot of people will say that, and they'll promote that they're in covenant with Yah, outside of Israel, that they're, promoting that, oh, well, I'm in covenant, but I don't have to do the Torah. So they're promoting that they could have access to the husband without that covenant or Torah. And so you think about, well, what do you call a woman who tries to have a relationship with a husband without a covenant? She's a harlot or a whore, just like we see in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 17 is talking about that. And so that's basically, the same concept as a person who is trying to have a relationship with a husband, Yah, outside of that covenant. So Deuteronomy 29, and I'm going to go down to verse 17. It may be verse 18, depending on your version. So let there not be among you a man, woman, family, or tribe whose heart turns away today from Yah your Elohim to go serve other gods of those nations. Let there not be among you a root bearing such bitter poison and wormwood. If there is such a person, when he hears the words of this curse, he will bless himself secretly, saying to himself, I will be all right, even though I will stubbornly keep doing whatever I feel like I'm doing. So that I, although dry and sinful, maybe added to the watered or righteous, but Yah will not forgive him. Rather, the anger and jealousy of Yah will blaze up against that person, and every curse written in this book will be upon him, and Yah will blot out his name from under heaven. And so notice that, there are people among you who have turned away from Yah. And that they say, well, the curse doesn't apply to me. I'm blessed. I'm okay. I'm doing what I feel is right to me or in my heart, they're, oh, well, I'm doing what's right in my heart. And Jeremiah has something to say about our heart. Jeremiah in chapter 17, in verse 9 and 10, he says, the heart is more deceitful than anything else and mortally sick. Who can fathom it? I, Yah, search the heart. I test inner motivations in order to give everyone what his actions and conduct deserve. So we can't trust our heart. We can't let our heart lead us. We need to look to his word and his ruach to lead us. So going back to the Torah portion, Deuteronomy 29, I'm going to skip down to verse 21, and it may be verse 22. When the next generation, your children who will grow up after you, and the foreigner who arrives from the distant land, sees the plagues of that land and the diseases which Yah has made it sick, and that the whole land has become burning sulfur and salt, that is being sown or bearing crops or even producing grass, like the overthrow of Sodom and Amorah, Admah and Zovim, which Yah overthrew in his furious anger. Then all the nations will ask, why did Yah do this to the land? What is the meaning of such frenzied, furious anger? And people will answer, it's because they abandoned the covenant of Yah, the God of their fathers, which he made with them, and he brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went and served other gods, prostrating themselves before them, gods they had not known and had not assigned them. And for this reason, the anger of Yah blazed up against the land and brought upon it every curse written in this book. And Yah in anger, fury, and instanced with indignation, uprooted them from their land and threw them out into another land, as it is today. Now, something interesting occurs here, where he talks about he threw them out into another land or cast them out. It is by Yashlachim. And it's hard to say, Vayashalachim is spelled Vav Yud, Shin Lamed, Yud Kaf Mem. Or, yeah, Kaf Mem. And on a Torah scroll, we see it spelled differently. On a Torah scroll, it is spelled Vav Yud, Shin Lamed, Kaf Mem. It's missing a Yud. And people are like, is that a mistake? And that, why is that so important? Because when you look at that, there's a Yud missing. There's a Yud missing. And then you're thinking, well, wait a minute, there's a Yud missing. And Matthew 5 in verse 18 says, yes, indeed, I tell you that until heaven and earth pass away, not so much as a Yud or a tittle or a stroke will pass from the Torah, not until everything that must happen has happened. And a lot of times in English, it'll say a jot or a tittle, but in Hebrew, that word jot is yod. Okay. And so not one yod will pass away from the Torah. And so why is this missing a yod then? And since the yod has a gematria of 10 or a numerical value of 10, we have basically 10 missing. And when you think, well, what's 10 in Hebraic thought? Well, 10 should trigger a couple of different things like the 10 words, but what's missing, the missing 10, the 10 lost tribes. And if the location of where this yud is missing is in that word for cast out. And what happened to the 10 tribes? They were cast out. And it was because of their disobedience of Torah that they were cast into the nations. Now, a second thing to look at with that word, Vayeshlachem, is that when you look at it on a Torah scroll, it is written with an enlarged lamed. And lamed is the letter that means to learn, okay, or to teach. Lamed is the word for teach, okay? And so in the midst of being cast out to the nations, Yah is trying to teach us a lesson. And what is that lesson? Are we learning to follow his ways? Deuteronomy 29 and verse 28 or 29, depending on your version, says, things which are hidden belong to Yah, our Elohim, but things which have been revealed belong to us and our children forever, so that we can observe all the words of this Torah. And, this verse, may not seem like some big revelation. We see, there are secret matters that belong to Yah, and there are things that are known only to Yah. For example, the big one is the intent of someone's heart. We can see fruit and their actions, but the intent of their heart. Someone may look like they're doing all the right things and they may look a certain way, but what is the intent of their heart? And, many believe that this is referring back to verse 18, where it talks about the intent of the heart. That person, like I said, may look the part, they may do the feast, they may eat clean, they may appear to be a follower of Torah, but inwardly their heart is, holds bitterness or is holding that hate or divisiveness or fear, or lack of fear of Yah. And we may not see it. And so it's those secret things of the heart which will be judged by Yah. And some see it that, there are things that Yah conceals. And there's the verse in Proverbs 25 and 2, and I've mentioned this one quite a bit. It says, God gets the glory from concealing things, and kings get the glory from investigating or digging those things up. So, there are things that are revealed, and you think about, okay, well, what is he revealed to us? He's revealed to us his word, his Torah. And the Torah is the best way to judge our hearts. Amos 3 and 7 says that Yah Elohim does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. And so again, it's, he's revealing his word, that's not something he's hidden. And, sometimes though that revelation, you've got to dig it out to see it. Also, in Deuteronomy 29, and it might be verse 29 or 28, there's this another scribal marking there, which is really interesting because it's in the phrase that says to us and to our children. And part of the word that says forever there. And what's interesting, why I said that phrase there, it has a scribal marking, it has dots over the letter. Labanu ul Balnenu, and then it starts ad olam. And so 11 of those letters have dots over them. Well, usually the dots are telling us vowels, but this is not the case here. And there are a total of 11 dots. Well, 11 is an interesting number because it's not really a number that we see that often in scripture, but we do know it's between 10 and 12. And both of these numbers we see a lot in scripture. 10 is usually a reference to the 10 lost tribes or the 10 words. And, 10 is always talking about, his divine will. And 12 is usually talking about his divine government. And so there are a few explanations as to what these meaning, and I prefer to look at how the number is used scripturally here, because there is an instance where the number 11 is used. And if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2, and it says, it was 11 days' journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the way of Mount Seir. And so from Mount Sinai to the promised land basically was 11-day journey. But it was because of Israel's rebellion that it took 40 years. And interestingly, those words were given in the 11th month of the 40th year. And so the their entry into the land is connected with the number 11, with those 11 dots there. This is, the last of Moshe's life. So and we know this is the 40th year. And so this is basically right here at the end of his life, the 11th month, they mourn for him for 30 days. So we've got this, 11 here, and it's connected to, what entry into the land, but also what prevents it. Because with the number 11, Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. And Joseph was a type and a shadow of Mashiach. And Joseph was called a master of dreams. He in his life, he depicts many, aspects or pictures of Yeshua. And with the number 11 playing a role in those dreams. Because, when we talk about in Genesis 37, when Joseph has the dream about the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down before him, the sun and the moon are his father and his mother. But the 11 stars were his brothers or the leaders of the tribes here. And so, in the life of, so in Joseph's life, there was 11. He had 11 brothers. And in the life of Yeshua, we also see 11 disciples witnessed and revered the resurrected Yeshua, as Mashiach. Judas, of course, the 12th one did not. He betrayed him and basically killed himself before the resurrection. So that left 11 Talmudim at his resurrection. And again, we see in the book of Daniel, in chapter 7, verse 24, it says, as for the 10 horns, out of the kingdom, 10 kings will arise, and yet another will arise after them. So you've got 10, and another one's going to rise after him. Now, he will be different from the earlier ones, and he will put down 3 kings. So in Daniel, there's this little horn that arises from these 10 horns, thus making 11 horns. And this horn basically was the epitome of Antiochus Epiphanes. In Daniel 7, verse 25, it says, and he will speak words against the Most High and try to exhaust the holy ones of the Most High, and he will attempt to alter the seasons and the law, and the holy ones will be handed over to him for a time, times, and a half a time. But when the court goes into session, he will be stripped of his rulership, and he will be consumed and completely destroyed. And so Antiochus was a type of anti-Messiah and the abomination that makes desolation. And this man, had that spirit of anti-Messiah, and he seek to change the times and the laws. And we can see this in 167 BC. Antiochus issued decrees against the Jews. And you can actually find a record of this in First Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 44 through 50. It says, it describes the decrees like this. The king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah containing orders to follow customs foreign to the land, and to put a stop to burnt offerings and meal offerings and libation in the temple, to violate Shabbats and festivals, and to defile the temple and holy things, to build illicit altars and illicit temples and adulterous shrines, and to sacrifice swine and ritually unfit animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to draw abomination upon themselves by means of all kinds of uncleanness and profanation, so as to forget the Torah and violate all the commandments. Whoever disobeyed the word of the king was to be put to death. Antiochus also ordered the burning of Torah scrolls and the death of anyone found with such scrolls in his possession. He also ordered the temple converted into one that was dedicated to the Zeus Olympios. So, when you look at that reading in Maccabees, First Maccabees, in the summary, he's basically profaning Shabbat, the feast. He's setting up idols. He's eating unclean animals. They're no longer able to circumcise. He's outlawing Torah, all of these events. So he is basically an epitome of the anti-Messiah. Now, tying this back to the Parsha, 11 is between 10 and 12. And so the person has to be able to determine or to discern between what's the spirit of the anti-Messiah and Mashiach. It's that same kind of principle. And remaining in rebellion, or whether they're going to be submitting to the King of Kings. And so this portion, like I said, is always read before Yom Teruah. And so our hearts is, during this month is reflecting on ourselves and looking at repentance and making teshuvah. And the root of that word teshuvah is shuv, which means to return. It means you're turning around 180 degrees and going back to where you were before. And so that's exactly what it's talking about in Deuteronomy 30. In Deuteronomy 30 in verse 1, when the time arrives that all these things have come upon you, both the blessing and the curse, which I presented to you, and you are there among the nations to which Yah your Elohim has driven you out, then at last you will start thinking that what has happened to you, and you will return to Yah your Elohim and pay attention to what he has said, which will be exactly what I'm ordering you to do today, you and your children, with all of your heart and your being. And he lays out for us in these verses exactly the order of events. I'm going to start in verse 2 and read. And you will return to Yah your Elohim and pay attention to what he has said, which will be exactly what I'm ordering you to do today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your being. And at that point, Yah your Elohim will reverse your exile and show you mercy. He will return and gather you from all the peoples to which your Elohim has scattered you. If one of yours was scattered to the far end of the sky, that Yah your Elohim would gather you from even there. He will go there and get you. Yah your Elohim will bring you back into the land your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. He will make you prosper there, and you will become even more numerous than your ancestors. So look at the order of events here. If you've strayed away, he gives you the path back. 1, repent, return to Yah. That's your first step. And then he tells you to obey the Shema. Obey these words, obey the Torah. And then it says that He brought you out of captivity by being gathered together, being in unity. And then they were taken into the promised land. So, something else occurs here, and it's a wonderful promise for us because it talks about, this is a picture for us that we're dispersed among the nations, and that if we will return, repent, obey his Torah, be in unity, that he is going to bring us, he's going to gather us together and bring us back into the land. And notice it says that he will return. If Mashiach hasn't come yet, so then how can he return? For those who believe he hasn't come yet, how can he return? He's got to have come first. Now, something else is hidden here because Hebrew scholars have counted all of the verses in the Torah. And, sorry, I just skipped them. When we look at this verse, this verse they say is actually 5,708. And that doesn't really sound familiar unless you are using a Hebrew calendar. And on the Hebrew calendar, 5708 is actually the Gregorian year, 1947 and 48. And remember that the rabbis start the Hebrew calendar at Rosh Hashanah, or, Yom Teruah, it's known by both names, and the fall of the year. And so, do you recognize the importance of that year? If not, May 14th, 1948 would be the year 5708, the day that Israel was reestablished as a nation. And this verse is talking about the return and bringing them back from the nations. It's linked together. He linked it perfectly for what would happen in 1948. Now, on a side note, that it looks like that, the Saturday evening, which would be this Tuesday, actually would be Yom Teruah. And on the Hebrew calendar, that is going to make it be the year 5786. Okay. So on Tuesday, or actually Monday night, starts Yom Teruah. So it's really the Monday night and Tuesday day. But it is going to be a new year. And the year is going to change to be 5786. Right now we're in 5785. That's why a lot of the names of the Torah portion I put up there is 5785. And so I want to look at a little bit about the Hebrew year here, because the Hebrew date actually breaks down into two parts, 57 and 86. And the first part, 57, is always read as the year of. So really it's the year of 86. And 86 is the numerical value of Pei Vav. And we've been in the year of the 80s so far. We've had 5 years so far. And so we're still in the year of the 80s. And 80 in Hebrew is the letter Pei, which is mouth. So we're in the decade of the mouth. And so we're in 80, but it's 86, which is the Vav. Okay. And the Vav is the Hebrew letter Vav, which also means hook or a connector. Because Vav itself means the word and. It's about connecting. And the letter Vav is also the numerical value 6, which is the number of man. And so if we go back to the very beginning, we can see when is the first time that the letter Vav is ever used in the word. And if you look at the Torah scroll, the very first time it's used is in Genesis 1:1. So if we go back to Genesis 1:1, and I'm going to read it in Hebrew, it starts, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et. That's the first time we see the letter Vav, is in the word ve'et. And it's translated as ant. But the Vav is connecting something, because it's connecting the word before it and the word after it. So the word before it is hashamayim, which is the heavens. And the word after it is haaretz, which is the earth. Okay. So this year is about connecting man. We're his house, about connecting man or his house. And what is happening here? The mouth, the pay, and the vav is connecting. So what we are saying is going to show what we're connecting to. And what do I mean by that? Are our words connecting us to Yeshua and Yah's word, or is it connecting us to the adversary and his plan? And so, as we've been in these 80s, it's, the focus has been on what we're saying, and, different years, it's been different aspects. But this year, it's really about, connecting to, which one are we connecting to? Are we connecting to Yeshua and his word? Are we connecting to the adversary and his plan? And so this got me to thinking about, okay, well, if this year coming up is going to be 5786, what is the 5786 verse in the Torah? And so actually I went through, just a second, I'll show you my little adding here. I went through and just on my little scratch sheet of paper started adding the number, how many verses were in each book, and then counting up. And so by my counting, this is what I have. The 5786 verse in the Torah, after counting up the verses, this is what I found, is actually in Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 46. And this is what it says. He said to them, take to heart all the words of this testimony against you today, so that you can use them in charging your children to be careful to obey all the words of this Torah. So this year, we should be putting words of Yah in our heart. And if the words are in our heart, then we're living them and we're doing them. And they are your testimony before others. And, are we going to obey his word? Or are we going to obey, the inclinations of our heart? That's what this parasha is about, standing on his word and being obedient. Now, going back to chapter 30, and I'm going to go down to verse 10 now. It says, however, all of this will happen only if you pay attention to what your Elohim says, so that you obey his mitzvot and regulations, which are written in this book of the Torah. If you turn to Yah, your Elohim, with all your heart, with all your being. Okay, so we're to guard his Torah. And the word that's used here for guard or pay attention is the word shamar. And it means to, keep watch, to observe, to perform, to protect, to pay attention or to heed. So we're to exercise great care over the commands of Yah and to observe and perform them, because we're the children of the Most High. We're we are commanded to guard these words. And, even the word shomrim is the word for watchman. And so what did the watchmen do? They stood on the walls of the city and they were there to protect. They were lookouts. They were guards for the city. And so, many people, will look at, well, the Torah is just too hard to keep. And, a lot of people will teach erroneously that, well, you can't keep them all. And, it's not deadly. It's not, and this parasha clearly tells us that it's not too hard for us. Some people say, well, there's so many of them, you can't do them. No, we're not commanded to do them all. There are some that are done only in the land. There are some that are only done by priests. There are some that are only done by men. And there are some that are specific to women. So there are ones that apply. I mean, doesn't mean that they're done away with. It means that there's certain ones that don't necessarily apply to me. And some that can't be done because there's not a temple. But let's go to Deuteronomy 30 and verse 11. It says, for this mitzvah, these commands, which I'm giving you today, is not too hard for you. It is not beyond your reach. It isn't in the sky so that you need to ask who will go up into the sky for us and bring it to us or make us hear it so that we can obey it. Likewise, it isn't beyond the sea, so that you need to ask, who will cross the sea for us, bring it to us, and make us hear it so that we can obey it? But on the contrary, the word is very close to you, in your mouth, even in your heart. Therefore, you can do it. So his commands, they're not too hard for us to keep, but rather it's the commands of men that they're adding to it, that make it harder and harder. And sometimes they don't line up with scripture. But it is the words of Yah that's going to be the plumb line, that is going to be what we're examined by. In Deuteronomy 30 and verse 15, he says, "Look, I'm presenting you today with on one hand life and good, and on the other hand death and evil. And that I'm ordering you today to love Yah your Elohim, to follow his ways, and to obey his mitzvot, regulations, and rulings. For if you do, you will live and increase your numbers. And Yah, your Elohim, will bless you in the land you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, if you refuse to listen, if you are drawn away to prostrate yourselves before other gods and serve them, I'm announcing to you today that you will certainly perish. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. And I call on heaven and earth to witness against you today that I presented you with life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life so that you will live, you and your descendants, loving Yah your Elohim and paying attention to what he says, clinging to him. For that is the purpose of your life. And on this depends the length of time that you will live in the land that Yah swore that he will give to your ancestors, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And so that's where, really this parsha really ends, because it actually, just goes through chapter 30, verse 20. But I really wanted to, stop right there and just say, you know what, when we look at this, it is all about, are we standing on his word? And this year, how important it is that we align not only standing on that word and having it in our hearts, but aligning our speech with his word. And, he tells us that, if we do that, if we are going to do that, it is going to be life for us. And that he's giving us life and not death. We get to choose. And he says, choose life, so that you're going to live and your descendants with you, loving him and paying attention to what he says and cling to him. That's the purpose of our life. It's not on making money and getting this and getting that. The purpose of our life is about living for him and teaching the next generation to do that. And not just for it to be lip service, but for it to be something that flows out of our heart, and that our actions that we are doing each and every day. So I know this is a little different since I'm normally doing this in a group, but I pray that you were able to get something from this, and that this year, as we're coming up on next week being Yom Teruah, that you will actually make a stand on his word and to put it in your heart and to live for him each and every day, and to have that be our focus and our priority. And that is what our purpose is about. May Yah bless you and keep you. And until next time, Shabbat Shalom. Have a great week.